Well, thank you very much, Jan, for that kind introduction, and thank you all for inviting me. I always feel incredibly sort of welcome whenever I've given talks for Coastwise, and I really look forward to it. And it's a pity this one isn't in real life, as I say, but I'm still looking forward to talking to you. As as normal, my subject is going to be, amazing animals, the amazing animals that live on our doorstep. And the story and the stories behind them. And this time I want to, even more than normal, I'll pick on a few individual animals again, or individual species, because I find that's the best way of sort of telling the stories. But this time, I suppose, as well as using new material that I've got recently about things I've learned just recently, so it's fresh for you, I've also tried to concentrate even more on sort of the questions that the animals are still posing, and also the challenges that they face, not just natural challenges, but challenges that we're giving them, things that we're doing to make their life difficult. And these are some of the characters that I'll be talking about, because that's the way I think of them. But I just want to give a very quick introduction to me. As Jan said, I'm a marine biologist, so first and foremost, and an underwater photographer. But one of the things I really want to get over in all these talks is that although that's how I'm quite often dressed to do my photography with a big camera, it isn't, these animals aren't just for people who go out on a boat for miles and dive deep. They're really accessible. And, you can see an awful lot of the animals I'll be talking about with a lot less kit. This is Teresa, my much better half, snorkeling in a giant rock pool. And a lot of the animals you can see that way. A lot of them are on the shore as well. You don't even need to get wet, but they're right there. And also, even more, as I'll mention, because of sort of restrictions and so on, quite a few of the photographs I'll be showing you today have been taken with no more kit than this: swimmers and mask and snorkel, and maybe a pair of fins, but and a small compact camera. I think a number of you use these sort of little amphibious cameras, and a video light and so on. So not high tech. But as Jan said, the whole aim of my work really is to just show people what amazing animals live around our coast. It's still staggering how many people think of our seas as cold and grey, and not much lives in them. And it's so important to tell them, because I think the more they're aware that these special creatures live there, the more they'll do things to look after them. Okay, so back to the subject, and I'll get on with our first character, that is a sea snail. Now, we have a lot of sea snails, and actually this photograph, I don't know if you can see, but I didn't take, it's got a whole variety of sea snails in the picture, but I didn't actually take it of the sea snails. I just came across later. Can you see the main subject? And I will be mentioning this later. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but that mass of seaweed there is actually a corkwing wrasse nest. But I'll talk about that later. As I say, it's the sea snails, and just in that one shot, you can see different species of top shells, periwinkles, limpets, and so on. And of course, they are all grazers. They graze on algae and microorganisms quite peacefully. But there's always one that's got to be different. And here he is down at the bottom. It's the dog whelk. And they are just amazing animals. And I'm sure I've talked about them before, but they continue to fascinate me. They, of course, are the driller killer of the seashore. They're carnivores. They hunt, and they've got this amazing mechanism where they can drill holes in hard exoskeletons, and they can prise open their prey as well. And in the literature describes their main prey as barnacles, which they certainly feed on. And to feed on small barnacles, they can just prise open those top plates where the little feeding hand comes out of barnacles. Larger barnacles, they can actually drill through the main house of the barnacle, if you like. And their other main prey is, again, according to literature, is mussels. And if you look on many mussel beds, you'll see these exquisitely drilled minute holes where a dog whelk has done its dastardly deed, using equipment linked to its radula, which drills mechanically, and also a chemical softener that helps the process. But it's not just, as I say, literature says barnacle and barnacles and mussels, but where we are, certainly around Wembury, they prey on limpets a lot. And here are some examples of them getting to work on drilling limpets. And limpet shells are quite thick, can take a dog whelk many hours, even a couple of days to drill through. And here are some examples of them. They've those two top limpet shells at the top show the classic drill hole. I like this one here at the bottom because you can see it eventually succumbed, but it's got all these holes that have been started by dog whelk. And you find a lot of the big, thick, heavy shells like that I've found recently with a lot of starter holes. And so presumably the limpet manages to shake the dog whelk off. And just so the dog whelk's got quite a lot to cope with. That's one of its challenges, stroppy limpets, though you can understand them not wanting to be drilled. And also even their own kind. This is a dog whelk that's been drilled by a dog whelk. So they're not averse to a bit of cannibalism. But one thing I want to say is there seems to be a local difference. A couple of years ago, I went and gave a talk on the Isle of Arran, and I sort of gave my normal spiel about dog whelks and drilled limpet shells and so on. And then a few days later, we met a couple on the beach who'd been at the talk, and they said, "Oh, came to your talk the other night." And ever since then, when we've been walking on the beach, we've been looking for drilled limpet shells that you talked about, and we haven't found a single one. And sure enough, I then started looking on the tide line and couldn't find a single drilled limpet shell. So local populations certainly differ, and this might be one of the reasons it might happen is because different barnacle species are more resistant to attack. And from what I can gather, possibly some of the more northern distributed barnacles are less resistant. So up there, dog whelks prey on the barnacles, down here in Devon. And that's something that might change with climate change because barnacle distribution is changing. So the prey preference of dog whelks might shift as well. But they don't just go for those, they'll go for anything with a shell to some extent. And this is one preying on an edible periwinkle, you can see as it crawls along. And again, can you see it's already had a go here, or another dog whelk has had a go, started a hole, and now it's carrying on. But I just want to tell you this other little story, and it's a bit of a confession, really. I feel terrible about this. A few months ago, I was very pleased to find this periwinkle shell on the beach, and I saw that this hole, I think made by a dog whelk, didn't actually get through, but this one clearly did. You could see daylight through it. So I thought, this periwinkle's been killed by a dog whelk. And actually the literature says that periwinkles are very rarely preyed on by dog whelks. So I thought, I'll take that home and put it, and I left it in my office to photograph later. And then after a few days, there was a horrible smell permeating my office. And unfortunately, it was actually this periwinkle. I felt terrible because it was still in there. And what it had done, I only just realized, is that obviously when it managed to evade the first drilling, but when it was being drilled for the second time, it managed to pull its operculum, the hatch door, right back inside the shell, right back beyond where this hole is. And this hole isn't at the edge, it's quite far in, but it actually managed to withdraw all the way up there and let the dog whelk do its worst and only be met sort of by fresh air. So I thought that was amazing. But of course I felt very guilty that this periwinkle had resisted the dog whelk only to come to grief in my office. But I had no idea. But just amazing what these animals do. The other fascinating thing about dog whelks is that their life cycle leads to local evolution. They leave these, they lay egg capsules that are static, and Also, what I didn't realise is that they breed all year. Just last week, I was finding dog whelk egg capsules on the beach, and these hatch into miniature crawling dog whelks. So unlike a lot of mollusks, there's no larval stage to drift in the plankton. And also the other thing about dog whelks, the adult phase, if there's plentiful food like this, barnacles, apparently an adult dog whelk won't shift, won't move anywhere. It'll just stay in one spot. And that means that you get, because of this localization, you get local differences in populations. And there's some classic work showing how, for instance, shell shape of dog whelks varies between populations. If their main threat, if they live on a wave exposed shore where they get battered by waves, then they tend to have a larger shell opening so the foot can keep a better hold on the rock. That makes them vulnerable, more vulnerable to crab attack. So populations living on sheltered shores where they don't have to put up with waves, but there are a lot more crabs, they have evolved with a smaller shell opening that makes life more difficult for the crabs. So you then think, well, if there's that sort of evolution going on, there's probably an awful lot going on in terms of prey selection with different barnacles changing, shells becoming more resistant to attack and so on. Then there'll be a sort of evolutionary arms race for the dog whelks as well. So, awful lot to find out about. And this is just an example of one of the crabs that the velvet swing crab that will attack mollusks of different kinds using a very patient approach. And it also proves velvet swimming crabs aren't vegetarians, which some of the literature will tell you apparently. What have we done to make life difficult for dog whelks? Well, of course, I don't know if you remember the issue with tributyl tin, the anti-fouling paint that was used on boats for a long time, and in areas where there was a lot of small boats, they were finding that dog whelk populations were being wiped out because the tributyl tin in minute concentrations, it was sort of one of the lowest concentration chemical ever been found to have an effect, was causing a process called imposex in the dog whelks, where it was making female dog whelks grow male sexual equipment across the opening to their ovaries and so on, and so that was sterilizing them, and it was wiping out the dog whelks, and they were wiped out from a lot of areas in the south of England where there are a lot of boats. There's now restrictions on tributyl tin use, and dog whelk populations are recovering, but presumably that recovery has been slowed by the fact that they don't have a planktonic larval stage. Okay. Our next animal I'm going to go to is a sort of much go faster mollusk, the cuttlefish, this incredible creature. And of course, the most remarkable thing about it, along with all its intelligence and buoyancy control and speed and responses and so on, is its colour change. And in the most basic way, it can match its background. This just shows a cuttlefish that's settled on a gravel seabed. A few seconds later, it's blended in perfectly, and it's not just changed its colour, but the texture of its skin. Those little bobbles on its back aren't where it's flicked up sand over it, which you might expect. They're actually where it's made little protrudences on its skin to resemble the sand. And this just shows the sort of camouflage. Hopefully you can see that, but it's quite remarkable how that small cuttlefish has sort of blended in with the background. But what I found fascinating was, although this was taken on a dusk dive, and although this cuttlefish was obviously keen to be well camouflaged, it was also very keen to approach me. So it was following me around and staying in front of my lights, because it was using the light. I think it was using the light to hunt its prey, small shrimps. And if you're there's a video of this cuttlefish hunting on my Vimeo site if you're interested in seeing that. And talking of hunting, cuttlefish use colour change to mesmerize their prey. They use sequences of colours to distract their prey. You see them hovering under clouds of fish like gobies using these colour changes, distract the gobies, and then they grab the gobies. That bottom picture shows the final colour change, and then the tentacles, the long tentacles reaching out to grab the goby. And different cuttlefish use different colour changes. This one used a sort of a bleaching effect just before it grabbed. And if you look very close up at the tentacles, you can see a goby caught on the suckers. And another diver I know has actually seen a pair of cuttlefish where one cuttlefish did lots of colour changes and its partner grabbed the fish, and then they swapped round, and the other one did the colour changes and the other one did the grabbing. So just remarkable animals. They also use colour change to communicate and court. So this is a male with bold zebra stripes and the female on the left. But what I like about this picture is I took this many years ago. It was one of the first times I'd encountered courting cuttlefish. This was, you can see it's at a seagrass bed. And it was only when I went to crop it for something, social media or something, just a few months ago, that I noticed, I don't know if the panels with the people hide this, but just at the side of the picture, you can see there is the arm of another intruding male. And I'd thought that this male was making this is the classic, this is cuttlefish for bugger off. This bold stripes on the top of the arm, spots at the bottom, and the arms held out wide. I thought that was aimed at me, getting close with my camera, but it almost certainly wasn't. It was aimed at this other intruding cuttlefish, particularly as this arm is the one that's being held out with the stripes on particularly. So there was another intruder there, and I was so concentrating on sort of my first chance at taking these courting cuttlefish, I didn't remember that other cuttlefish. So it's just, yeah, amazing. And here, this one is definitely, this one is holding out his arms with the stripes and the spots, guarding his female from this other intruding male. So that's classic cuttlefish behaviour. And here, this pair are actually mating. The cuttlefish is the male here on the right is passing a packet of sperm to the female with one of his special arms. This the female, and here his arms again are giving the classic keep away signal. And I didn't see any intruding cuttlefish around there, so that possibly was aimed at the voyeur cameraman, saying keep away. But there's even more to cuttlefish colour change. This is a, did some more reading this year and found that this white square pattern they use is one of the classic patterns. And this they use classically on, not to blend in with the background, but to break up their outline, which you can see it does very successfully. And when they use that is when there are large objects in the background, so not sand or rock. And you can see this is on a shingle seabed, Torbay, sorry, not shingle, a stony seabed, so large stones, large shells, and it's used this, as I say, classic background way of breaking up its outline. The other response of cuttlefish, which is quite mysterious, is that what divers sort of call the two-arm salute. Looks a bit like a V sign that they give often when you approach. They stick up two arms like this, and this is the flamboyant response. And quite often it's used to actually blend in with the seaweed. And you can see this one in the bottom right, the arms sort of very thin and brown, and they mimic these brown tendrils of seaweed very well. But very often it's not to mimic seaweed. And you think, why on earth are they doing that? They're sticking up tentacles. They're not matching the seaweed. They're not aiding camouflage at all. What are they doing? And apparently what they are doing is letting the predator know, a potential predator know, that they know the predator is there. So, and you can imagine this is quite effective what it means is you're trying to sneak up, you know, it's saying to the predator, you're trying to sneak up on me, but it isn't working. I can see you. And so if you attack, then I'll be very ready to jet off. I might even harm you with my arms and sharp beak. I might squirt out some ink. You're really better off preying on something else that hasn't spotted you. And so in the sort of very sophisticated cost-benefit analysis that goes on in predators, whether hardwired or intelligence, this is going to make an awful lot of difference, this sort of response. Okay, what are we doing to make life difficult for cuttlefish? Well, sadly, we are catching more and more of them. This is just an example of some cuttlefish traps at West Bay. In Dorset, there were lots of them on the quayside, and we trap them in large numbers, and they're also caught, trawled in huge numbers. And I think it's currently the most valuable catch at Brixham, which is one of the biggest fishing ports. And sadly, when they're trapped as well, quite often they use as bait, they use females to catch males, but whether they do or not, the cuttlefish lay their eggs on the cages. And I don't know if you can see that because they're shriveled up. All these there are lots of little black bulges all over the cages here, loads here, and those are all the cuttlefish eggs that are destroyed as well. And various moves. I think it might be the Dutch that are trying to develop better catching methods that don't catch laying cuttlefish and so on. But the one important thing from our point of view is that there are currently no catch limits, no quotas for cuttlefish. It's a free-for-all. So the likelihood of that leading to a horrible crash as soon is very concerning. Okay, so I'll just now do a bit of a segue that's into the next animal, who's a bit of sort of a late entry. This showing some cuttlefish eggs, as they often are, laid on seagrass, and an animal that's very well adapted to seagrass is here. I don't know if you can see it, but it is a deep-snouted pipefish there. One of the seagrass blades has an eye. That's about the only way you can tell. And here it is, deep-snouted pipefish. You can see why it's called deep-snouted. It hasn't got the sort of indented head of most pipefish like the greater pipefish. It's sort of parallel, and so it looks just like a seagrass blade, and it's got the same colour as well. So why am I introducing this animal? Well, I wrote a piece a couple of days ago for a diving magazine about the species, and I picked seagrass pipefish. And so I did a bit of digging about their biology, and it's just amazing. They follow the classic pipefish model, where the female lays her eggs into a brood pouch on the male, and then they develop into miniature pipefish. But in this pipefish, they've actually found that the babies, when they're threatened, will swim back into dad's pouch. That hasn't, you wonder, is this really the only species that happens in, or is this just the only one that it's been seen in? So that's one fact. The other thing is that because they've done a lot of research on mate choice, and because the males put so much effort into looking after the young, because they put that resource in, they're very choosy about the females they mate with, and they will mate with larger females because they lay sort of better quality eggs. And there's a certain parasite that they carry that looks like, that appears as black dots, and males will avoid females with that parasite that shows, because that affects their sort of productivity, the females, the parasite. So the males will avoid that. And when the researchers mimicked the appearance of the parasite, apparently with dots of tattoo ink, the male pipefish avoided them as well. But my favourite fact about them is that the females will likewise prefer bigger males. Females will generally choose out or choose bigger males because they have sort of more brooding capability. But if the female, because of presence of predators or so, has to make do with a smaller male, it will lay eggs with a higher protein content to compensate for the sort of slightly substandard male in terms of brooding. And you think this is all going on evolving in a pipefish that people probably think is fairly simple. So I just thought that was a wonderful example. Okay, so what are we doing? Of course, seagrass is one of the sort of most endangered habitats in terms of pollution, land drainage, climate change, coastal development, recreational activity, a lot more boating activity is leading harm for anchors. And there's some wonderful work going on in terms of reducing impact of mooring and anchoring and so on, these seagrass friendly anchoring, and also reseeding areas of seagrass, both going on at the minute. Ocean Conservation Trust at Plymouth is doing some work, so if you're interested, have a look at that. Okay, which leads me on to another animal, the shore crab, and the challenges this guy faces. I chose one in a seagrass bed because of that, but shore crabs have always been one of my favourite animals, and they're what got me into marine biology in the first place. What I found out recently was, shame to say in a way, that it was one of my first rock pool rambles. Night rock pool rambles at night. The September before last at the BioBlitz, and what I hadn't appreciated just was what nighttime meant for shore crabs on the shore, because I think one of their main hazards is birds, gulls and crows, so at night they don't have to worry about that. And also because the limpets are up, are grazing, and limpets are light sensitive, so limpets presumably do see the shadow of a crab approaching, so it's an ideal time to grab limpets off the rocks. They don't have to worry about bird attack, and boy, do they take advantage of it. The rocks were covered with these, and the pools with these shore crabs, all munching away on limpets, that they'd managed to clear off. Of course, crabs, which I've talked about the molting cycle before, but the molting cycle is fascinating. The fact that a shore crab, all crustaceans, have to leave, their suit of armour, grow a new suit of armour regularly throughout their lifetime so they can grow. A shore crab typically molts 18 times on average in its lifetime. And the molt as well plays a big part in reproduction, because in most crab species, the female is only receptive for mating just after molting. So you see crabs like this in pre-mate embrace, where the male has got hold of the female and is waiting for her to molt. You can tell from the chemicals she gives off. And this is clearly what's happening here, because the female has got this deep orange colour of a shore crab that hasn't molted for some time, and that's obviously what's interested the male here.
You've mentioned that they can molt up to 18 times. What's the time span between molts?
Good question. It's very variable depending on the age. It stretches out as they get bigger. For instance, the one this is one I kept in an aquarium. The first few molts, when they're tiny, can be sort of fortnightly almost, if there's plenty of food, 2 or 3 weeks. And then as they get older, the last few molts may be many months apart. So it really stretches out. And quite a lot of the big crabs will molt once a year towards the end of their lives, and then at the end they'll go into the sort of what's called the terminal molt phase, where they'll never molt again, and they'll just die of old age in that spell, possibly because of the waste compounds that they concentrate and deposit in the armor, and they run out of space, so they build up in the tissues.
So how long do they live roughly?
A shore crab lives 3 or 4 years. Edible crabs about 20 years. Lobsters, I know, but similar to crabs, about 50 years.
Thank you, Paul.
Something like that. Thank you. So, so I was talking about the reproduction, and the only time that I've ever seen a shore crab or a normal crab, if you like, molt in the wild was a female in the protective custody of a male. So this is a female molting. She's coming out of the armor suit here, that hinging by the eyes, being guarded by the male, and he then mated with her straight after the molt. And then crucially, he will guard her while she hardens up. Obviously, he's fertilized her eggs, so it's in his selective advantage to do that. But this, the time of molt is very dangerous, because crabs, when they've just molted, are soft, and also they're slow, because the armor suit that they've just molted is an anchoring point for the muscles. So, and not so much around Devon, but in one particular spot in Norfolk, where I dive wherever I can, it seems to be, molting seems to be very dangerous. And I believe it's because there aren't enough molting sort of hideaways. And so you see an amazing number of shore crabs wandering around with obviously bits of, you can tell from the texture, these are pieces of newly molted crab. They're sort of papery, the papery suit of an edible crab, another shore crab that's been snaffled. And I did see this rather gruesome example of an edible crab that was daft enough to sit out in the open after it had molted. And I was there when this large shore crab just came and tore it to bits. And as I say, very gruesome. And here he was. And in fact, I think, and then that shore crab was driven off by another one who tucked into this helpless crab. But something that mystifies me is what this area is chalky. It's the chalk reef found by sea search divers along the North Norfolk coast, and edible crabs will excavate these, or seem to, these craters in the chalk. This one large edible crab seems to have built its own love nest, where he's imprisoned a female behind him, again waiting for her to molt. So whereas swimming crabs have long enough legs to hold on to a female and wander around, edible crabs built for strength rather than speed seem to jam, the male sort of jams the female in the back of a hole and waits for her to molt. But they don't just excavate the chalk, they seem to eat it. At certain times, you can go and find small edible crabs just covering the chalk reefs, and they appear to be breaking off tiny pieces of chalk and eating them. And myself and a colleague actually wrote a paper postulating that what they were doing was eating the chalk and increasing the calcium in their bodies, and thereby speeding up the rate at which they hardened up. You would think more calcium in the tissues would make the shells hard quicker, and that you'd think have a massive selective advantage. You know, every little time you could save while a crab was vulnerable would help it. But it was actually it was ruled out by the referees because there's no mechanism known for calcium to be used in that way. But I still, well, I'd like to somehow share that information, possibly in a more observational type journal, than so people are at least aware of it, because it does seem rather strange thing for crabs to do, and it doesn't seem as though they're getting any normal food. There wasn't algae or worms in with the chalk particles they were eating. Okay, before just to mention our own down here, particularly our own spider crabs, I did say about normal crabs being the only normal crabs being very unusual to see them molting out in the open. Of course, spider crabs do things differently, and they rely on safety in numbers, and they molt out in the open in these big aggregations. And I think I've shown you, I'll just show this still first. The molt that they congregate for is often the pubertal molt, where they become sexually mature, and the male, for example, appears with his big claws for the first time. And then after the sort of molting caravan has been, it looks like a battlefield with all these empty crab armor suits over the seabed. And I don't know if this video will play. I think I've shown this before, but it's just to show what hard work it is for a crab molting. Is the video playing, Jan? Ah, not too jumpy, because often videos on Zoom are very jumpy. But you can see here's a spider crab in the middle of molting. Ah, now it is buffering a bit, I think. Here it is. But now the video's speeded up, you'll be glad to hear. So it only takes a couple of minutes rather than 20. And here is the spider crab emerging. And it's starting to pump its legs out. So it's got to get its legs out of the suit. This is just the old bit of armor at the top. They don't respect privacy much. But remember, this is all happening, as I say, in reality, 10 times slower than this. But it's a very difficult process getting the legs out, especially when a colleague just uses you as a vantage point. And they also leave part of the gill structure behind. And you can see this crab doesn't, if these were non-spider crabs, they would just get eaten if they molted like this out in the open. And now he's got the really big work of getting those claws out. Because remember, this is a male, this is his pubertal molt, so it's the first time his large claws have seen the light of day. And that's a big effort getting those out. And there it is. He's out. But you can imagine through all that process and what he has to go through afterwards to go from that soft, rubbery shell to a hard shell. There's an awful lot of calcium salts that have to be absorbed. I mentioned about calcium before. And what are we doing to make life difficult for animals that use calcium? We are, of course, turning the, changing the pH of the ocean. And just mention this because it has quite a low profile compared to climate change, but I've heard marine biologists say that the biggest impact of climate change on the environment is going to be the dissolving of carbon dioxide in the sea and the change of the pH. Acidification is sort of a slight misnomer, because what it is the pH slightly reducing, but the effect of that on the calcium balance of all these animals that use calcium, not just the obvious ones, perhaps like crustaceans and mollusks, but all animals that lay down calcium in any form, worms, brittle stars, starfish, and fish, and so on. That will be a massive, massive impact. Right. So back from the spider crabs. Now, one thing I just want, the rate I'm going, I might go over the hour. Is that a problem? Not sure yet. Well, probably be about an hour. Okay. Thank you. Right, back to the shallow thongweed forests that are so common around Devon. Beautiful places. Just a reminder, this shot, was taken at high tide when the water's very clear. But if you were to walk around on the reef here, avoiding those snake locks and enemies at low tide, you'd be in about sort of thigh deep water. So it really is shallow, and really these beautiful sites are accessible to snorkeling in the right conditions. And one of the favourite animals here is the corkwing wrasse, and this is a male guarding his nest. And here is a video of a male building his nest, sorry. So he's building his nest of seaweed under the crevice, and research by Jeff Potts at the NBA showed back in the 70s, showed how they used different types of seaweed for different parts of the nest. And what I've just found out recently is that this hard, crusty seaweed, the pink corallina seaweed that they use on the outside of the nest, not only is it hard for protection, but those fragments, because remember, seaweed doesn't have roots, it just grows. Those fragments continue to grow after the wrasse has put them on the outside of the nest. So they actually knit the outside of the nest together and add strength. And I think that's amazing. I'm not sure even birds do that, you know, get the material they build the nest out of to carry on growing. But and just beautiful colours as well. But as I say, as I mentioned earlier, when I showed those pictures of sea snails, they don't just build nests subliterally, they build them in the intertidal zone. Presumably, they go off and wait nearby in a pool or a gully or whatever, and then come back when the tide's in to do more building work and look after the eggs. But here's the nest. It can be quite difficult to see until you get your eye in, because that pink weed that's very characteristic of the nest bleaches in the sunlight, so it goes white, but it's quite distinctive once you get your eye in. But as this one is, something Jeff found was that all intertidal nests are in crevices facing north to keep them out of the bright sunlight. So our corkwing wrasse builds his nest. This is the brightly coloured male, and what he's looking for is a female with a prominent blue egg-laying papilla, which is a signal to the male that she's ready to lay her eggs. And I'm not sure that I've shown you this before. This is the first footage we've got of a female visiting a nest, and here she is. So she's much drabber in colour than he is, than the nest holder, and that blue egg-laying papilla is very, very prominent. But the twist here is she a real female, or is she a sneaker? About 1 in 10 male corkwing wrasse aren't colourful home builders like him. You can see the nest here that he's built. They are sneakers. But we presume that he's looking rather unwelcome, but we're presuming that this female is laying eggs during those twisting moves, and that he's fertilizing them. But what was interesting is that a very short time after this, he's just checking out the camera, a very short time after this, another female came along. You can see again that very prominent blue papilla, and it is a different one. I mean, it looks smaller, but also you can tell from the markings it's a different one. So is the fact that this wrasse has come along very soon after the other one, does that mean it's a sneaker that hasn't been detected by the male, although he seems to treat her like another female? Something I've noticed recently, I was very surprised on a dusk dive to find this corkwing wrasse asleep on the bottom, or seeming to be asleep. They go into this sort of torpid or resting phase at dusk, and you can find them in amongst seaweed and so on. Again, on that night rock pool, there are a lot of corkwing wrasse in the pools sleeping in the weed, but this one was just sleeping out in the open. And it was about 3 feet from where a conger eel lived, which I was rather surprised by. I don't think I'd choose to have a kit there. But just mention as well something about the other wrasse. So we've got 5 common wrasse species around Britain. Here's the corkwing, the male, and then there's the cuckoo. This is the one that you'd be very, very unlikely to see snorkeling. This is the female and the male. I'm sure you know that all cuckoo wrasse start life as females. Some become males, later on in life. And in their population, if a male has like a harem, if he dies, then the oldest female in the harem changes into the male. Ballan wrasse do the same, but they don't have the obvious colour change. And then there are the other small wrasse, the rock cook and the gold cinny. But there are all sorts of interrelations between the wrasse. You see this feeding cooperation where small rock cooks follow large ballan wrasse around, and ballan wrasse appear to deliberately feed the rock cooks. They pick up pieces of rotting kelp off the seabed, swim up into midwater and spit them out, and the fish, small rock cooks and so on, congregate and presumably picking isopods and so on that are disturbed off the kelp. And the ballan wrasse doesn't feed then at all. He just returns to the seabed. So why are they doing that? Well, I think it's possibly to keep the cleaning services of the rock cooks I'll mention in a minute around, but also possibly the smaller fish. Having a cloud of smaller fish swimming around you all the time may well act as a sentinel against predators, give you advance warning of predators. So that's why they'd do that. But the other discovery I made this year from having more time to look at photographs that I was delighted by was that on one of our local reefs, I realised that this ballan wrasse that came and swam alongside me in 2020, checked back through some other photographs, and it's actually the same individual. So in 8 years, it's been the same individual that's been on that one spot of reef. It's known that ballan wrasse and all the wrasse are quite territorial, and it's also known that ballan wrasse live for up to 30 years. So I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but it was still lovely to see evidence that this one individual had been there all that time. And just as an aside, going away from wrasse, I was looking at some close-up photographs of a nurse hound, again in this area, and found that I was just looking at the close-up of the eyes, because I have a bit of trouble telling the small spotted cat shark from nurse hounds, and one of the features is the eyes. So I took sort of cropping these close-ups of the eyes to send to a friend, and realized that the dermal denticles were identical on the photographs taken several months apart, and it's the same individual. So it's the same individual nurse hound in the bay. And this shark expert actually wasn't very surprised by that. They're very faithful to spots, but I still found it exciting that that you could recognise individuals without using tags and so on. But just going back to the cleaning, the most common cleaning interaction you see in the wild are rock cooks cleaning parasites from ballan wrasse. But all the wrasse, apart from the cuckoos, do clean. And of course, as I'm sure you know, that is their downfall in some areas, because they are highly prized as cleaner fish in Scottish salmon farms. So some of our wrasse here in Devon are on a one-way ticket to Scottish salmon farms, and where they are used, I believe, only in one cycle, so that the incoming wrasse are killed after one cycle, so of salmon production, so they don't transfer parasites. And this is a wrasse pot, and this is the door. You can tell wrasse pots are quite different. They have a different door mechanism. So there are controls on. I see that that up in Scotland they're just putting in controls. Down here, Devon and Severn Ifka responded very quickly, and they did put in controls on the sort of time of year that there could be potting, limits on the number of pots and so on. So thankfully that was put in, but it's still a worry that wrasse are being removed when they're such intensely sort of territorial fish. Obviously, there are a lot of animal welfare issues with transporting live fish all the way from Devon and Cornwall up to Scotland. And there are worries about bycatch, because you see a lot of, as well as the small wrasse in the pots, you see a lot of animals like sea scorpions and blennies, and they should be put back straight away by the fishers, but you know, if they're guarding eggs and they're in the pot for many hours, several days, they're going to lose eggs. So is this fishery having more impact than is assumed? Certainly a concern. And also something that we've seen a lot more of is fish louse parasitization of certainly young corkwing wrasse. You can see there's one on this top one, two on this one. So is that increase? Could it be due to some of the key wrasse being removed from an area, cleaners? Because apparently cleaning is a learnt behaviour, and one of the problems with breeding captive wrasse for use as cleaners in the salmon farms, wrasse are difficult to breed in captivity, but also apparently captive bred wrasse, when they're put in a salmon cage, don't know how to clean until they're shown by a wild caught wrasse, which again is quite intriguing bit of animal behaviour. Okay, so now I'm going to come on to the last character. I'm sure you can guess who it is, but introduce him by showing how most corkwings build their nests in a sensible place. This one built it in a not very sensible place. He built it right next door to the stroppest character on the reef, who chases him off every time he comes back with some building material. And who is that? Well, that's Brett, the tompot blenny. And just an introduction to tompot, I think you'll certainly, anyone who's seen my talks before will know about them, but you know the shanny, the small common blenny that you find on the shore. The tompot blenny is quite a close relative, found a little bit deeper, just below the shore generally. It's quite unusual to find them when you're rock pooling. Sort of jazzier colour and these very prominent head tentacles, but still close relatives. And so I called that one Brett. Now, was I being fanciful? Well, no, I wasn't, because the thing that I've found most fascinating about tompot blennies, along with their biology and their their charisma, is the fact that their skin markings make individuals recognizable. And you can see example of 4 males there, and just, you can use patterns anywhere on their body, but the ones below their eyes that I've highlighted there are quite useful, and you can see how they're very distinctive, that you can recognize individual fish. And so classic blenny biology, the male guards eggs laid by a female. A male has a territory, and here's a male with a female here laying eggs, and this is a raft of eggs already laid, and then the male stays to guard the eggs faithfully until they hatch. So that was known about blennies, but there was an awful lot that wasn't known about their biology, and this was really helped by us being able to recognize individuals. And so our study, you can see I've only updated it to 2017 when I wrote the last paper, but over that time recognized 44 individuals, male and female, in one small patch of reef. And some of the things we found were that that it wasn't known whether a male would occupy the same crevice sort of successive breeding seasons, but our star performer here is Bradley. He's occupied the same one for 7 consecutive breeding seasons and the intervening winters, and he's still there. He was still there last week, happy to say. Now, why do I call him bourgeois? Well, I don't know, but that is the proper term for a male blenny that has a territory, which I think is wonderful. There are sneaker blennies and there are satellite males, but the biological term for a male with a territory is actually bourgeois. And what else have we learned? We've learned that you get injured in fights, and then can show quite good recovery, even when they're badly scarred around the mouth. And also discovered that I wasn't known before that there were sneaker males, and we found an example. Might be a bit confusing, this slide, but Billy is on the left, Bertram is on the right, and in both cases they were a sneaker a sneaker male in another male's territory, but then they became territory holders later on. So they've both become respectable bourgeois territory owners. And here they are with either with eggs, prominent anal glands, or with a female. And it was actually an accident initially when we discovered this, because we assumed that Billy was actually a female, until he turned up the next year with anal glands, the characteristic of a male, guarding eggs. In case you're wondering, could it change sex? Blennies are not known to change sex. No blenny species are known. So while it's always a possibility, it's far more likely that they're sneakers, because that is known in other blenny species. But the females are possibly even more fascinating than the males, because they appear to change colour and change colour patterns depending on their roles and times of year, whether they're competing with other females, because there's a lot of competition between females for males, because males put so much resource into guarding eggs, and they are much more mobile than the males. We actually nicknamed this individual the Traveller, because we always saw her on the move. And they can even change within minutes. Here's two pictures of an individual. They're not very good pictures because they're stills from video, but they show the same individual when she's on the left there with a pale pattern. She was courting a male, trying to lay eggs in his crevice. Here, she was in a dispute with another female, gone a lot darker. So they can change quite quickly. And the role of head tentacles is interesting. We've had a Cornwall College student, Louise Hammond, do a university project with a lot of my sort of archive of photographs, and show that statistically, males have the larger head tentacles than the females, which reinforces the thought that they are used in display as well as having some sort of chemosensory function. But this I find really intriguing. So these are Devon. It's not just Brighton humans that are flamboyant. Look at this Brighton blenny, and the Brighton blennies do have, under Brighton Pier, have these, many of them, amazing head tentacles. So how do you explain this local difference? I mean, from other observations, it seems that where population density is very high, the head tentacles are bigger. So is that, but how do you get local selection where you've got planktonic larvae? Are the planktonic larvae actually going home, or is there some sort of phenotypic plasticity involved? But it just shows that we're only just scratching the surface on knowledge of these amazing animals. Oh, just mentioned something about the turmoil reef, which sort of came out of the special circumstances of this year, because this is another place where I sometimes snorkel and see the blennies. And because I could actually walk here from my house, and I could just swim without any diving gear straight out to the crevice, I could actually do this through a lot of lockdown and go and visit the blennies. And 2020 was quite a unique year for them. In this one crevice, where you can see that we had a blenny, one male in 2016, but then we had another male occupy for 3 years. He turned up injured this spring, and his 4th year, actually 4th breeding season. But then he disappeared, and another injured male appeared. A bit more on Clifford later. So, and that is incredibly unusual to see a change in male occupant of a crevice within a breeding season. And then I thought he was there to stay. Even more surprised when a mystery blenny turned up briefly, occupied it, and blow me, another one appeared. In case you're wondering why he's called Quaid, it's because he was the 4th occupant, and that means Quaid means 4th. But it's so unusual to see that churn, that change in occupancy within a breeding season. So that was new to us. And now, even more unusually, there's no occupant there at all. So this crevice has been continually occupied since since we've been observing back sort of before 2016. But since Quaid disappeared in mid-August, there's not been a blenny there. And why is that? Is it visiting spider crabs? No, because we've seen blennies since then. Is it this very unusual sea scorpion we saw with the blue eye covering? I don't know if anyone's ever seen a sea scorpion with, I don't know whether it's some sort of disease, but it's amazingly opaque eye covering. And they are predators of tompot blennies, but no, we've seen, I suspect they only prey on the small tompot blennies. But what I do suspect it might be is a Montague's crab that's now living in the crevice. Now, I've never known before a crab be able to occupy a tompot blenny crevice, because the tompot blenny will chase them off. But Montague's crabs, sorry, because they are strong, and the shape of them and the shape of this crevice, I think might have actually taken it over. But that would be very, very odd. Now, I did mention Clifford. Again, with more time to look at photographs, I discovered Clifford's backstory. So it was a bit sad in a way to see him end up as a very brief occupant of another crevice, but elsewhere on the reef he'd been for a long time, and you could go back and pick him up from 2015 as a very new settler, through sort of juvenilehood the following year, and then in his prime guarding a crevice and eggs, before, as I say, ending up as a rather battered old gent later on. But why was that, as I say, why this turmoil on the reef? Because other blennies could just get on with it. This is Leo, you see, with 2 female visitors, we think, unless one of them's a sneaker. And he got on with it despite, and this is what I think caused the turmoil, is rising sand level on the reef. Not man-made in any way, but just from unusual summer storms. And you can see how it affected Leo's crevice. Here are the eggs. Here it is a few months later, filled with sand. And we suspect that he would have lost the eggs on the floor, but the eggs on the ceiling would have survived. And you can see when the sand again receded, so the sand was up to where the red arrow is, the sand was up to there, and just with some late summer storms, it moved again down to below where the green arrow is. So that's big sand movements, and that filled some of the crevices at the bottom of the reef, even worse than this, and we think created rather a housing crisis for the blennies on the reef. So some were made homeless, there was more competition, and it led to this churn. But if you're wondering why Leo is called Leo, it's because Leo is the first name that props up on Google if you look for a boy's name that means brave. And we think he's rather brave because he lives right next to where there's a large conger eel often lives. And just show you a bit of video which we found amazing this year, was where a tompot blenny actually approaches a conger eel. Now the conger eel is small, though it's not as small as it looks from that because of the angle of the lens. But what that tompot blenny is doing, because we suspect that conger could take the blenny, but the tompot blenny, out of curiosity or territoriality, is actually approaching the conger. Okay, so what are we doing to tompots? Well, what effect is having? Well, another one is possibly another effect of climate change with invasive species, because there's a newcomer on the reefs, the variable blenny. Here he is, a resident of sort of the southern Atlantic and Mediterranean, same genus, different species, but they've now got a foothold. A couple of years ago, we saw the first one at Wembury. My eagle-eyed son spotted that. There it is, but there's a thriving population in Plymouth Sound. They're actually smaller than the tompots, but you wonder what impact that's going to have. It's interesting from sort of just initial observation. It seems to me that as well as being smaller, and those therefore presumably preferring smaller crevices, they actually look for different crevices that are vertical facing rather than horizontal facing. So if they occupy a different niche, there's more of a possibility for them to coexist. But I'll end now with a picture of Brett again, showing me what he thinks of me, and variable blennies probably. This is one of their display things he does, is spit out seaweed. So I'm going to end there. I've gone over time. Just a few plugs. The Wildlife Trust's campaign still ongoing for highly protected marine areas. Very important that we turn some of these sort of well, what have been accused of being paper parks into areas with better protection. Coming up to Christmas, just recommend Teresa's book on Benny the Blenny for children, and the Benny the Blenny website. I don't know if any of you have seen the film we put together for Wembury Marine Centre, sponsored by South West Water, called Wonderful Wembury. Please have a look at that on the Wembury Marine Centre YouTube channel. I don't know if any of you are into social media, but I do a daily Instagram on UK marine life and behavioural stories and so on. So please have a look at that. And but yeah, I'd just like to say again, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all you do in raising awareness of marine life and all the conservation work you help with, and yeah, everything. Thank you very much.